Recently, Tony Heller responded to my video debunking his claims of climate fraud by the authors of the US National Climate Assessment. He suggested I pulled a nefarious bait and switch and madly plucked out of the air the theory that the US Dust Bowl was exacerbated by poor farming practices. But does the science support his argument? Let's have a look. My name is Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show for Changemakers. I did a video a few days ago pulling apart the claims by noted climate change commentator Tony Heller that the latest US climate assessment showed evidence of how so-called climate alarmists distort the data by selecting their start dates carefully. I made a number of substantive rebuttals to his case in that video, and when I saw that he'd very kindly taken the time to reply, I wondered which of those substantive points were going to fall apart under his forensic attention. To my surprise, the points of debate didn't focus on the substantive areas at all, but really just two passing points of detail. Well, let's pull them out. First of all, in his original video, he suggested that heatwave data had been selectively presented. I responded with some discussion about whether the argument that there had been a recent upward trend were justified, and he pulled me up on a point of detail and made a very specific accusation. Here are the key points, edited for brevity.
First, let's look at the heatwave graph, which starts in 1960. They carefully picked a period during the global cooling scare to start their graph so that they could show heat waves increasing over time. And here's the underlying data from the part of the National Climate Assessment which didn't go out to journalists and politicians. I overlaid the part of the graph which went out to policymakers over here in this corner on top of the underlying data, and you can see exactly what they did.
So here we're talking about heat waves, and he's correctly pointing out that the graph going back to the 1900s shows a much bigger spike before the period of the graph used in the climate change document. And if you took that spike out, you'd say it was pretty much flat.
Mallen pulled a bait and switch. That's not the graph I was using in my video. That's a different one from the EPA. The graphs I was using were from the National Climate Assessment, but they were hidden in the final document. The URLs are written right at the bottom of the slide. The final document, which went out to policymakers, intentionally hid the underlying data from the National Climate Assessment. Mallen is trying to change the subject away from the fact that the people who put out the document intentionally hid their own data.
To be honest, I was bemused at this one. The graph I used was so close to the one that Tony used and obviously had the same features that he was referring to. I took it to be equivalent since my response didn't make any kind of play on any of the minute differences. Let's remind ourselves what the phrase bait and switch implies. It implies something substantial was changed that affected the argument. So you might change something that looked similar but was different in an important way, and you hoped nobody would notice the switch. And then you made a brilliant point that depends on the now significant point of difference. But that's not what happened at all here. And I know that Tony's followers won't take my word for it, or indeed anything for that matter. Maybe you'll listen to this guy on this website I found called Real Climate Science. Blog post February 14th, 2019 by one Tony Heller. Introduces the US heatwaves graph and any other graphs including the offending heatwave one, making exactly the same points as he was in the original video. And then, oh wait, well, that's the EPA graph right there. What does he have to say about it? Data from the EPA shows the same thing. And then not only does he do the transposition with the original graph, as per his video, but then he demonstrates that it works again with the EPA one. So Tony, it's a pretty weird bait and switch. If I'm using data that you yourself said showed the same point you were making. I mean, those graphs were demonstrably the same in the features that Tony was discussing. I thought so, and a few months ago, Tony himself thought so. It seems in this case, he noticed that I was using a different one and just thought, aha, gotcha. And I don't understand how he forgot in that moment that he himself had already said that not only did the EPA graphs show the same thing, but he'd also done the comparison to demonstrate it. It comes down to whether we want to trade superficial gotchas or whether we're interested in what the underlying data shows about the truth of what's happening in the world. Because if we're going to use this sort of thing as a focus, I suppose I should have drawn attention to your own graphs. Because although both of those graphs come from the same report, they don't show the same thing. The shorter time frame bar chart shows the heatwave season in days. So the number of days where there were heatwave conditions. The longer timescale graph you compare it to is heatwave magnitude, how intense the heatwaves were. Obviously, these are not the same measures. So the suggestion that the shorter timescale graph was just an editorial decision to avoid using the longer one is clearly not true. According to the narrative of the bar chart graph, the graphs with the hatching, the first and the last ones, are hatched to indicate that each has incomplete data for that decade, which rather suggests that they don't have the data in the right form for before a date sometime in that first decade. Because I don't know why it would need to give that indicator if it wasn't the case. So I noticed that when I was doing my first video. To be honest, because the broad sweep of what Tony was saying still fitted the graph, I've decided to see if I could find a point of substance that indicated whether the story being told that there's an observable recent trend of warming in the face of the historical data was a valid story that justified choosing the start date that it did. I could have just said, Tony's wrong because these two graphs measure different things. But maybe if the one he did use had started earlier, it would have shown the same features. It doesn't seem unrealistic. So even though it's clear that Tony was wrong in this was about manipulation, it's more interesting to know about the basic underlying point. Is it reasonable to show a shorter time frame and suggest it points to a recent warming trend? I mean, that's the point of substance. Because if the answer's no, then you ask harder questions. And I'm quite happy to ask for harder questions because people are people and there's bad behaviour on both sides of any divide and good behaviour too. So hence the other related graphs I then showed, which Tony would have seen because they were part of the set that came with the EPA graph that he'd already used on his blog, that showed that this was indeed a reasonable thing to do. That was the substantive point, and not one that Tony chose sadly to comment on. The second kickback came about from my passing comment about the Dust Bowl. Now again, I wasn't really expecting this to be a point of contention. It was really thrown in as an informational aside, but nothing is too trivial to be picked up on in this game. Also, I'm learning. The first thing to note is that language is important. I'm sure I make mistakes as much as anyone, but I try to use my language fairly precisely, and I did so here. See if you can spot the essential difference between what I said and what Tony says I said. It's worth noting what that spike actually is. It is, of course, the great Dust Bowl of the 1930s. If you glance at the scientific literature about that period, we still don't conclusively understand all of the factors that led to the awful conditions that blighted so many lives, but it's believed to have been made more intense by the poor farming methods that were being used at the time.
Now let's look at Mallen's claim that farmers caused the Dust Bowl. There was a worldwide drought in 1934. This article from June 1934 was written by the chief meteorologist of the U.S. Weather Bureau. Worldwide drought is seen likely. Weatherman admits there's something wrong and that no one knows why. What is wrong with the world's weather is a question I've been asked many times in the last few weeks. This map shows the actual Dust Bowl area. It's a pretty small area centered around the Oklahoma Panhandle. So the farmers in this region caused a worldwide drought? That theory is complete nonsense.
But it's believed to have been made more intense
And caused a worldwide drought?
Around 90% of Tony's diatribe of ridicule depends on the suggestion that what I actually said was that farmers caused the Dust Bowl, which caused a global heatwave. And of course, I said nothing of the sort. Now wait a minute. Apparently repeating what I said, but changing it slightly so nobody notices, and then amplifying your argument on the difference that you yourself introduced, sounds like a familiar concept. Yes, indeed. That, ladies and gentlemen, is an actual bait and switch. You say it, and it sounds kind of close, but it reframes it in a way you can then more easily attack. And it's a great rhetorical device for a live debate if you're trying to win something rather than arrive at the truth. Not so much so for video, where we can rewind and listen again. And of course, no, I didn't just pluck this out of the air. In fact, to quote Tony on this,
can we get back to doing science, please?
This 2009 paper from the National Academy of Sciences studied the unique features of the American Dust Bowl. A few quotes. The Dust Bowl drought of the 1930s was highly unusual for North America, deviating from the typical pattern forced by La Nina, with the maximum drying in the central and northern plains, warm temperature anomalies across the entire continent, and widespread dust storms. Here we show that the inclusion of forcing from human land degradation during the period, in addition to the anomalous sea surface temperatures, is necessary to reproduce the anomalous features of the Dust Bowl drought. Human-induced land degradation is likely to have not only contributed to the dust storms of the 1930s, but also amplified the drought, and these together turned a modest sea surface temperature forced drought into one of the worst environmental disasters the US has experienced. NASA also tells the same story on this page, talking about the 1934 drought thus. Two sets of conditions led to the severity and extent of the 1934 drought. First, a high-pressure system in winter sat over the west coast of the United States and turned away wet weather, a pattern similar to what occurred in the winter of 2013-14. Second, the spring of 1934 saw dust storms caused by poor land management practices suppress rainfall. So yes, there was a drought in a number of parts of the world in 1934. Doesn't affect anything we're discussing here, since nobody has been foolish enough to suggest that a US-specific phenomenon had affected the whole world. Yep, lucky nobody did that. Because yes, there were drought conditions in a number of places in the world. Heat waves and droughts have been a thing throughout human history, and I'm not aware of anyone suggesting that such things have never happened before climate change, and certainly nobody in the scientific literature, which is what we're interested in here. But still, if we look at the global climate temperatures through that time, you'll see the bump that is the hot period worldwide. Are we really going to argue that that bump makes a huge difference to the clear and observable trend in that graph? Anyway, thank you, Tony, for taking the time to respond to my video. I think respectful dialogue is important in these areas, although I'm not sure that between us we'll convert many of your followers to that idea, given the evidence in the comments section of my last video. No doubt we'll see some more of the same this time. I look forward to the intellectually rewarding discussion continuing.